Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Navigating this economy has never been more confusing or frustrating, and we are here to help with this. I'm Kris McCusker, and this is In This Economy, where we keep you informed on what the latest economic news means for you. Canada's fertility rate, that's the average number of children a woman births in her lifetime, is now the second lowest in the G7, according to data from StatsCan. And the rate has been generally declining for over 15 years. Canada has now joined the group of lowest low fertility countries, which includes South Korea, Italy, and Japan. So what's going on? I'm Kris McCusker, and today on In This Economy, it seems the cost of raising a child might be part of the problem. Chantal Braganza is a writer and editor based in Toronto, and you wrote this piece for the Walrus. It pegs the cost of raising a kid in Canada at just shy of $300,000. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
How did you get to this number?
Well, technically, I'm not the person who arrived at this number. This is that number is from a report that Statistics Canada released in 2023, the fall of 2023, by taking data collected from households across the country from 2014 to 2017. So they broke it down further into different categories. The $293,000 is what the average Canadian middle-income family of a nuclear family of two parents and two children, that is what those two parents can expect to spend on each child between the ages of 0 to 17. So this data had been, long in the works of being collected, was published last year, and at that time, it was discussed pretty widely on talk radio, headlines. It made quite a bit of a stir just to see it all collected and published in that way. I think everyone knows that having children is expensive, but seeing it calculated over the course of, one part of a child's lifetime is quite sobering.
That wraps up this episode of In This Economy. Thank you for listening.
When you break down the
I'm
expenditures
Kris
by
McCusker.
what that money is spent on, the three top categories that it highlights is first is housing, second is transportation, and the third is food. So when we talk about expenses, we're not even talking about things that are specific to parenting, but the fact that the cost of living for everyone, those are three things that everyone is paying for, regardless of whether or not you have children. It's just the fact of having a family compounds and it expands that quite a bit.
Well, and it would seem to me a little bit as well, coming out of the pandemic, like we did see, inflation at levels that many of us had never seen in our lifetime. And that housing affordability concern was sort of pushed more to the forefront because everything else was inflated. The price of everything else was inflated. Fair?
Yes. I don't think there was a single family I spoke to for this piece who didn't bring this up as top of mind, whether or not it was people who were in their early years, had kids and were in the early years of it, or people who were just getting to the point in their lives where they were thinking about putting the gears in motion to have children. Housing, if they could afford where they wanted to live, if they needed to move, if where they were living now was a place that they wanted to raise children in. It just, housing, cost, location, the first factor.
The other thing that kind of hadn't dawned on me, if you have always had a traditional job, women in particular might not think twice about taking mat leave. But if you're self-employed, which your article states makes up now about 13% of the Canadian workforce, it's not so easy to take mat leave when you're working for yourself.
It's not. If you are self-employed, if you rely on contracts, like if the contracts make up the majority of your employment, if your employment is shift-based, like say you work in the hospitality industry and the hours that you work or your salary is also not supplemented, but largely made up of gratuities as well. These are all structures of employment that do not fit into the model that EI is best designed to serve. And given that we know that those sectors of employment, like more people are employed by the gig economy and that'll likely continue to grow, I do think it's worth thinking about how the way parental leave is structured right now can be better designed to help parents and help people think about how they would take a parental leave. A lot of people who specialize in this say that EI itself, employment insurance, is maybe not the best delivery system for it, and that an entirely separate program, similar to what exists in Quebec, would take a while to set up, but in the long term would be a lot more beneficial.
This again, I mean, this is another segment of our economy that is, being brought to the attention of governments as far as, the way we used to do things maybe no longer works. And another example that you cite in your article is the government looking to make changes so that daycare is a little cheaper, which is part and parcel for these women who may be looking to take mat leave and are self-employed. When it's time for them to go back to work, if they're self-employed, they can't be paying all of their income to daycare.
No. We've seen the federal government's rollout of $10 a day daycare over the past, I think would be in year 2. We've just completed year 2 of the rollout, and there have been some bumps along the way. If we compare or just look side by side Quebec's journey, which took about 30 years to its subsidized daycare program, and what the federal government's provincially doled out program of it is now, I think some of the bumps that we're seeing now, individual daycare's inability to continue with this reimbursement program, not being able to hire enough early childhood educators to keep up with demand, to make more spaces for kids. These are all things that the Quebec system dealt with back in the 90s when they rolled out their own programs. So some of these things were predictable, are going to take some time to best figure out how to address. And realistically, I don't know if it was ever going to be a very quick solution. In the grand scheme of things, it's a very good thing. It's just going to take a while to iron out so that it better reflects what new parents need. And unfortunately, that it's not in best service of new parents right now.
It sort of explains a little bit as well. I mean, I did some digging and in as sort of connected to your article. I guess in 2023, this is Canada's fertility rate stood at 1.26, which is the lowest rate ever recorded. It's on par with countries like South Korea, Spain, and Japan.
If you were to speak to any demographer, I think they'd tell you that, OECD countries across the board are seeing birth rates declining. And that's for a number of reasons. I think what's interesting, or interesting is maybe a strange word to use. I think what's notable here, and what we're focusing on here about affordability, is that many of the other factors that contribute to declining birth rate are seen as net positives for a society. Higher rates of education, closures in the gender pay gap, changing social norms about what a family looks like and what a family should be, greater access to reproductive freedoms, birth control. Those are all net positives for a society. When a factor like a public's ability to look into their future and decide that parenthood might not be for them, not because they don't want it, but because they don't think they can afford it, that's relatively new to focus on. And I don't know if that's a net good for society.
And you came upon another interesting finding.
If we look at countries that have been successful in slowing down the birth rate decline, no country's been able to successfully turn it around. Once birth rate starts dropping, it's very hard to do that. But countries like Sweden, France, a lot of Nordic countries that have slowed down birth rate decline, they've done so over decades because of long-term targeted policies that don't focus specifically on the act of childbearing, but more on social safety nets and people's ability to feel secure in their lives. So that's better paid and more comprehensive parental leave, ones that are targeted at both parents being able to take leaves, fulsome, well-funded, and well-staffed childcare systems, and housing affordability. So I think long term, like, we do have answers about what we should be focusing on. It's just that I don't think any of these things are going to be solved overnight. And in some ways, I do think thinking about the ability to afford a child is going to require a shift in the kind of timelines we're thinking about. Realistically, we're not talking about people who are going to be parents within the next couple of years, but a generation from now, a couple of decades from now. That should also be, the timelines that we're thinking of.
What is the message that you wanted to get out there with this piece?
I guess there's two ways to look at the situation that we're in right now. And one is the very pragmatic economic sense of, if people, or if birth rates are declining, and if perceived affordability is a factor, how do we address that is one. And the second one that is a little less tangible, but I do think is worth considering on a social and ethical level, is that, if affordability specifically, so I'm not talking about changes in birth rates because people are deciding that parenthood is not something that they want in their life. That's something entirely different. But if affordability specifically, if people cannot see themselves as parents because they can't afford it, and it's something they otherwise might have wanted to be an aspect of their life, I'm not sure, what does this say about us as a society now, and about how people start to think about their futures, going forward.
You also have a book coming out next year.
I do, next April, 2025. It's called Story of Your Mother.
Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.